This weekend, many of you who are here with us this morning, you know that Dr. Kimmel was with us yesterday for our parenting conference and did a fantastic job, was able to speak into our families and have had multiple conversations, both today with our fellowship from the church as well as pastors who are here from other churches today, of the impact that the conference yesterday made on them, and then a few individuals today about some of the things that Dr. Kimmel talked about, the abundant living that should be our goal. And Pastor Brian asked a couple of weeks ago, with understanding what was going on this weekend, he wanted us to see about maybe keeping it in the same theme. And so I'm praying about what God would have us to look at tonight. He led me to a passage in Nehemiah chapter 4, where I believe is one of the main passages where we see, just as Macy talked about God fighting for us, where we're supposed to fight for our family. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is the fight for our family. Nehemiah chapter 4. Before we get to the passage, we'll be reading verses 1 through 14. But before we get there, just to give a little history about what's going on through this story of Nehemiah, if you actually go back and look in the original Hebrew manuscripts, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are actually together in one book. And they both teach this story of the history of the city of Jerusalem and how the Babylon captivity occurs, and what the spark of this Babylon captivity, Nebuchadnezzar destroys the city of Jerusalem, including the temple. About 50 years later, the Jews began to return to the city of Jerusalem. They began to allow them to return back. And that's where we find the opening, the beginning of chapter 1 in Ezra. We see the Jews begin to return back. We see that King Cyrus has made this edict and they've been allowed to return. About 15 years later, around 520 AD, the work began to rebuild the temple. That was their first goal. They wanted to have a place to worship, and so they rebuilt the temple and they rebuilt the elements of the temple. They began to rebuild some of the city, but one of the last things that they chose to rebuild was the city wall. Now, the city wall was a very important thing to every city in that time. One of the things Dr. Kimmel talked to us about yesterday, that each child, and not just children, but every person has three basic needs, and one of those basic needs is to feel secure. That's one of the goals that we as parents should provide for our children. We should provide that security for them, and we all, even as adults, we all need to feel and have that desire to feel secure. Excuse me. So when we look at the Israelites and we see the Jews about 80 years after the temple has been rebuilt, Nehemiah comes in, and Nehemiah around 445 AD is when he begins this process of trying to rebuild the city walls. Now again, the city wall was there to provide security. It was there to provide safety from the outside world that would try to attack it. And it was kind of the last thing that they needed to rebuild before they were really able to start working on all of the homes and all of those things that had already been destroyed. Their first goal was the temple. There were some other elements that they rebuilt, but this portion in Nehemiah is where they're trying to rebuild the temple, not the temple walls, but the city walls, so that they can to survive. So we'll pick up in Nehemiah chapter 4. As I said, they've already started the process. Nehemiah is already there. He's come into Jerusalem. On the way into Jerusalem, he picked up some supplies for this project to begin, and they're now here. The building has begun, and so we'll pick up in chapter 4 and verse 1. Now when Sanballat heard that they were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish it up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yes. What are they building? If a fox goes up on the wall, will he break it down? If a fox goes up, he will break down their stone wall. Hear, O God," and this is Nehemiah's prayer. This is Nehemiah's cry out to God. "Hear, O God, hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight. For they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders." So he built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. Notice that word very. They were very angry. Verse 8, and they all plotted together to come up and to fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion on it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. In Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall and open places, I stationed the people by their clans or families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers. Fight for your sons. Fight for your daughters. Fight for your wives, and fight for your homes. This evening, I want us to understand one major thing, that our families are worth fighting for. Regardless of where you are in your family dynamic, maybe in here tonight you have younger children who are in the Family Ministry Center tonight, and they're working on their Christmas program that will be coming up in December, and you're in here tonight just so that your children are able to be a part of that program, and they're working on that. Maybe you're in that younger phase of parenting. Maybe you're like myself and you have children who are in our student ministry who are in small groups right now working on their trunk or treats for Wednesday night to be able to work with our Awana students. That's what our student ministry is doing tonight. All of our small groups are working on these things for Wednesday night because they want to serve and to love on our Awana children. So maybe you're like me. Maybe your children are a little bit older. Or maybe you don't have children in this child rearing time anymore. Maybe your children are older. Maybe they have children on their own. So maybe you're a grandparent. Maybe you're here and maybe you're a toddler. You're not a toddler, but maybe you have children who are a toddler. But I want us to understand that this passage tonight is applicable to every one of us, regardless of where we are. Or maybe even you're here tonight and you don't have a family. Maybe you don't have any children. God hasn't given you that opportunity yet or that blessing yet, and maybe it's coming down the road, or maybe it's not in God's plan for you, but there's still some things to learn because we all need to fight for our families. When we pick up this passage, we'll go back and start breaking things down. There's 3 major points that we're going to look at tonight. And after these 3 major points, I want to try to give you 3 things that I believe can apply to all of us, regardless of what phase of life we may be in. So there's 3 major points and then 3 things we're going to kind of try to send you home with today. The first of these points is I want us to look at, we see in the first part of this passage, we see the opposition by the enemy. We see these individuals who are here. We see Sanballat and his group of people who are the Bible says that they jeered at the Jews. They were angry. All right. First off, they're angry because these Jews are trying to rebuild the walls of this city. And if you study through the book of Ezra and you see when the Jews are trying to rebuild the temple, it didn't make the enemies happy, but they didn't really care about that because they knew that the city walls are still torn down, so we still have easy access to come in and really do whatever we want. They weren't worried if the Jews worshiped their God. They rebuilt the temple. They started rebuilding their homes. It wasn't until this moment in the history of this story that the opposition, that the enemy really started to get upset about this. And they realized if they start rebuilding this wall, then we're going to lose our ability to influence them. If they're able to rebuild this wall, they have protection. If they're able to rebuild this wall, they're able to keep us out of this city. And what we've already done is we've destroyed these people. We've broken them down. We've got them where we want them. And so now we need to keep them here. And so they try to, the easiest way to try to get someone to not do what they're working on, instead of bringing physical opposition to start off with, they try to work on their minds. They try to play mind games with Nehemiah and his workers. So you see there in verses number 1 through 3, we see they start by ridiculing these Jews. The ridicule to stop the work. That is the first thing they set out to do. They want to ridicule them. They want to make fun of them. They want to get the Jews questioning, is this even possible? And Sanballat begins by posing some different questions. The first one he says is, what are these feeble Jews doing? What are these feeble Jews doing? What that says in our vernacular today, Sanballat is saying, these Jews are too weak to finish this. They're not strong enough. They don't have the manpower to be able to finish this. I mean, because again, mind you, these city walls it wasn't like, they're building bricks like we have on our homes today. These would have been large stones that were maybe the size even of this pulpit here. And the first thing is he's intimidating them, saying, first off, what are these feeble Jews doing? They're too weak to complete the work. The second thing he asks, he says, will they restore it for themselves? Will they be able to do it all by themselves? What he's saying here is they require outside help to be able to complete this work. This isn't something they can do. They need people on the outside to be able to help. I remember when Keisha and I were first married. I grew up in a home where my dad had trouble with his back my whole life. And so, most dads take their sons out and they work on cars and they show them how to chop down trees and farm and do all these different types of things. Well, my dad didn't have that ability because of his trouble with his back. And so because of that, that wasn't a part of our relationship. I mean, it wasn't something that he taught me how to do. And so when Keisha and I were married and I'm the man of our house and there's something that goes wrong in the house and something's got to be fixed, I never knew how to fix anything. And so she did just what every wife tries to do. Well, if we need something fixed in the house, well, let me call my dad. Because her dad is a handyman par excellence. He is great with his hands. And so there would be times she would call her dad and he'd come over and he would fix something. And as the man of the house, there were times it would mess with my pride. There were a lot of times it would mess with my pride because I need to be able to fix this stuff. I want to be able to fix this stuff. And there would be times that he would work with me, and he tried his best to show me, but I was always, I can do this. I could do this by myself. And so, when we first started, there would be a lot of times earlier in our marriage, it would rub me the wrong way. And now we laugh about it because, you know what? If God didn't call me to preach, I would not be overweight because I wouldn't be able to eat because I'm not good with my hands. That's not a gift that God has, that hasn't something that God's given me. But what's really neat is now, like I said, we have a teenager. Our son Evan is 15, and he is very good with his hands. The reason he's very good with his hands is because there have been many, many times when his granddad would call him and say, hey, bud, let's go out to the country, which is some farmland they have, and they work on things. They'll put up a fence. They'll fix this. They'll fix that. They do all these different kind of things. Back about a week ago, our hot water heater went out of the house, and I've changed one before, and Evan and I said, let's do this. We've got this together. And I said, I want you to try to do it because he's done that many times with my father-in-law. And so we're in Home Depot to pick up the pieces, and Evan's he's a little flustered because he wasn't sure if he was going to get the right parts and all these different things. And so he calls my father-in-law. And as he's talking to my father-in-law, I can see Evan, the confidence that Evan has. From where he's panicking, I don't know if I can get the right stuff, I don't know if all this. And as he's talking to my father-in-law, I see his countenance just totally change. He's got it. He knows that he's going to be able to fix this, to replace this hot water heater. And so sure enough, we get to the house and we pull out the old hot water heater, we hook in the new, and my father-in-law is an electrician, so he's coming over to do the electrical stuff. And there's a couple of things that Evan's just kind of anxious and nervous about. But when my father-in-law shows up, all of that nervousness went away. Because for the last 15 years, my father-in-law had invested in his life and had shown him these tools of the trade of how he can do this stuff, but it helped him with that confidence. So Evan now has that ability to do it by himself. When you look at the Israelites here, they knew how to rebuild the wall, but what Sanballat's goal here is he's setting his goal is to get them thinking, well, can we really build this by ourselves? Is this something we're really capable of doing? The second question he asks is, will they sacrifice? All right? So in what we would say today is these guys are too religious. They're going to be too religious making all their sacrifices that they're not going to be able to complete it. They're too religious for this. And they were a religious people. They did honor God. They did those things the right way. And so what Sanballat wanted them to do was he wanted them to say, okay, this work is more important than your relationship with God. So he's trying to get them to rethink this and to think way too much. If he can get them to think about this stuff, he can defeat them that way. The fourth question that he asked is, will they finish up in a day? Well, and he's making fun of all of these things, and that today says, you're going to be too slow to be able to complete this task. And then the last question that Sanballat asked, will they revive the stone out of the heaps of rubbish and the burned ones at that? Because back when the city was destroyed 150 or so years earlier, one of the things they did is as they tore down those cities' walls, they would burn those city walls. And so what Sanballat is, his goal here with this last question is, will they even be able to build it with those stones? And those stones, even the ones they have, they're burnt. And so he's using these things to confuse them and to put doubt in their mind. And then on top of that, probably the greatest slap in the face, so to speak, is what Tobiah, the other enemy here who's named, he says this, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, will he break down their stone? So this fox who weighs, maybe 5 or 6 pounds, he's saying, listen, after they build this thing, if a fox were to climb up on it, it's going to crumble. And so they're making these comments, trying to get the Jews to think about this stuff. If your mindset is defeated, they understand this principle, that if your mindset is defeated, the result will end up being the same. If you're already defeated in your mind, you have no chance at victory. You have no chance at victory. So we see this ridicule, but we see the ridicule doesn't work. If you look at verses 4 through 6, look at Nehemiah's response. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had mind to work. As the city wall was destroyed, there was nothing left that was vertical in this. If you study this story, now we see that the city wall had been built to about half the size. They're successful up to half this point. Nehemiah, if you study the life of Moses, one of the neat things about Moses, and I hope that I could say the same of me, is Moses he had a heart for his people. And when you look at Moses and his heart for his people, throughout Moses' history as he's leading the Israelites to the promised land, there are many, many times when the Israelites act a lot like us. They doubt God. They do things they're not supposed to do. And when God wants to send judgment, when he wants to say, I'm through with you, Moses always prayed to God, God, please forgive their heart, forgive their thoughts, forgive their minds. Don't hold this against them. That's not what Nehemiah says here. Nehemiah isn't forgiving. Nehemiah, and again, because these aren't God's people, that he's wanting God to forgive. He wants God to bring judgment on these people. He wants God to inflict this. He wants God to allow this judgment to be inflicted on them. And so Nehemiah realizes that us just working with their heads is not going to work. So he takes the next step in the process. He begins to develop this scheme to stop the work. We see the scheme in verses 7 and 8. So when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry, and they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion on it. One of the things that's very interesting here, if you go back and look in chapter 2, Nehemiah and the Jews are in Jerusalem. They're rebuilding the city. North of Jerusalem is the land of Samaria. Samaria's leader is this guy we see here, Sanballat. The main instigator through this whole process is Sanballat. His right-hand man is Tobiah. So if you were to look at a map and you see Jerusalem here at the center, north of Jerusalem is Samaria, Sanballat's land, Sanballat's country. To the right, you see Tobiah, who's his right-hand man. And he's from Ammon, which is just across the Dead Sea from Jerusalem. And then the other individual that we've seen so far in the story is just south of them. The land is called Idumea, which the leader of that land is Gresham. And if you look in chapter number 2 of Nehemiah, you see where these three individuals come together, and they first begin to try to thwart this effort to build the wall. And as they first do this, as they make these first attempts to stop this wall being built, the Israelites' response is they just pray. They just pray that God would allow this to not take place. God allows it to not happen. And so at this point in time, they're pretty much surrounded. But when we get to chapter 4, something's changed. Sanballat no longer has the north, the east, and the south. He's also gone and recruited the Ashdodites from the land of Ashdod. And so now you have the Israelites here in Jerusalem, and they are completely surrounded by their enemy. All north, south, east, and west, the enemy wants to attack them because the enemy knows that we can't allow these people to continue building this wall. And if you look at verse 7 is something very interesting that Nehemiah points out. Nehemiah said earlier in verse number 1 that Sanballat, when they were building found out they were building the wall, Sanballat was angry. In verse number 7, but when Sanballat and Tobiah, the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Asherites heard they were repairing the walls of Jerusalem, that the walls of Jerusalem, the building was going forward, that the breaches were coming together, they were very angry. So now all of a sudden, Sanballat, Tobiah, Gresham, they've tried to make fun. They tried to play a mind game with the Israelites to get them to quit building this building, and it has taken their anger a step further. Now they understand we can't make this a mind game. We've got to go in and attack these people. We've got to make this plan. We've got to put something into action. All right? So we see that he's angry. And so now what we begin to see takes us to our second point, the discouragement of the people. In verse number 10 through 12, we see this discouragement. The workers, the Israelites, we see that they're discouraged because they know now that our enemy is not just angry, they're very angry. Our enemy doesn't just have us from the north, the east, and the south. They've got us on the west. They're going to be coming at us from every angle they possibly can. So naturally, there's going to be discouragement. This discouragement is found in two different ways. First off is through internal problems. We see there in verse 10. In Judah, it was said, now understand, Judah is the entire nation. Jerusalem is the city. So when Nehemiah says this, in Judah, it was said that the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much trouble. He goes on. He says, first off, we see this statement that in Judah, it was that these things were being said. Nehemiah is trying to help us understand how extreme the doubt, the depression, the fear is for their people. This isn't fear that's just crippling these people. He's saying that this is so bad that it's impacting the entire nation. It's impacting all. So he's using this extreme to help us see my people are really struggling. My people they're really filled with doubt. And this is so bad that it's affecting our whole country. And here's the three things where they see this doubt. We see, he says this first. We see the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. The first thing he says is their strength is failing. Think about it. These men who have been building this wall, now the wall is about half to its normal height, probably about 10 feet tall. So imagine taking these stones where they were 3 or 4 feet high, and you're just picking them up and using your team to move them here. Now you've got to go 10, 15, 20 feet tall. Naturally, the physical burden is beginning to wear on these men. They're tired. They are worn. He says that the next thing that Nehemiah says is that there's too much rubble. There's just so much stuff because they're building this wall, but as you build the wall, there's so much stuff that they just continue to have to move. So they're working so much more. And then he says this, the final statement that we see by Nehemiah, or that the Israelites are making, the statement the Israelites are making, is that by ourselves, we will not be able to build this wall by ourselves. Now remember, it's one of the questions that they probed them with earlier. Are you going to be able to do this all by yourself? And finally, they're beginning to feel this defeat. Well, these were the internal problems. Well, not only we have these internal problems, we also have these external problems. It's one thing to be defeated on the outside, on the inside. If we're defeated on the inside, we're already a defeated foe, or a defeated person. But the reality is, Satan doesn't just attack us on the inside, he also attacks us on the outside. Look at verse 11 and 12. Verse 11 says, and our enemies said this, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. And at that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. So there's these internal problems that these people are having on their own, but now they have these outside sources. First off, they see the enemy that's coming. They know these guys are coming and they're going to attack them. But not only that, they also have their brothers that live outside of Jerusalem in the other cities that are near them. They're saying, listen, and here when Nehemiah says they came 10 times, he doesn't literally mean they came 10 times. But he says, when he says this number 10, it represents that they continue to come back and say, listen, they're going to kill you. They're going to defeat you. Again, please come to us. There's safety if you leave this city. And so they're defeated from all over. There's this plea from this brothers. So there's discouragement. The people are discouraged because of these internal problems that they have themselves, but also these outside conditions, these external problems are causing this discouragement that they have. But finally, we see the leadership of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was probably one of the greatest leaders that we ever see throughout Scripture. He reminds me of a great, great football coach. Nehemiah writes this in writes this in verse 13. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, or in some translations, your Bible say families. I'm reading from the ESV tonight. Mine says clans, yours may say families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. First off, we see that Nehemiah has a strategic plan here. This is the first time that we see through the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a plan of action. Earlier, as I mentioned earlier, their plan, Nehemiah and Ezra both, when the enemy would plan these attacks, their response was, listen, we're going to pray, and we're going to allow God to take care of this situation. We're going to pray, and we're going to allow God to handle this. It's now gotten to the point where prayer is not doing it. So there has to be an action that comes along with it. There has to be this change. And so Nehemiah has this strategic plan. The first thing is this strategic plan, we see the location, that it's in the lowest parts of the space behind the walls, in the open places. The lowest parts of the wall would be where the wall was still the shortest. Okay, because remember, some of these places it's been built to half its height, so it's maybe 10 feet tall in some areas, but there's still some places that aren't quite tall enough. There are also some places where it hasn't quite met together. So as he's positioning his people in this great location to understand, as they come, we need to have you stationed here in the lowest places so that you can protect this wall, you can protect our people, the lowest parts. We see the location. We see that he also partnered them in their clans or in their families. As I said, most translations call it families. All right? Think about it. It makes sense. He puts them in their families because he knows that an individual is probably willing to do whatever they can to protect all of us, to work hard to build this wall and to protect what we've done. But if I put these people in their clans, in their families, the reason some translations use the word clans is because it's not just mom, dad, brother, sister, that it's an entire clan. That it would be like, grandma, grandpa, and all of their kin, all of their brothers, sisters, cousins, it represents the whole clan. That's what he means. It's not just mom, dad, brother, and sister here. That this is your whole family. And so if you think about it, Nehemiah knew that these people would be willing, maybe even to die for these individuals. But if you put their family, if they're there to protect and to fight with their family, they're going to fight even harder. They're not going to let anything happen to their family. And so he knew that. He understood this. And so he partnered them in clans there. And then the final thing that we see is he gives them their weapons of choice. All right? They're able to use sword, spear. He says, you use these weapons. So he's got this strategic plan. We're going to put you here in these places where the enemy may come in. We're going to position you here with your families, and he's given them the tools to be able to fight. So I say Nehemiah is like the perfect the perfect coach. The coach does everything he can to prepare his team for that time whenever they're going to play. This is what Nehemiah does. But just like Nehemiah here, every good coach that I've ever had, the ones that were the best, always had a pregame speech. That pregame speech was that which they told you right before you go onto the field. And as they tell you this, it just brings everything together right before you get started. Listen to Nehemiah's pregame speech. Here's strategic words right here in verse 14. He says, and I looked and arose, and I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. I've said this before a few different times. Fear not. You know, there's a very, very well-known, famous pastor of a church that has been quoted saying that the Bible has the phrase "fear not" or some variation of it in it 365 times. That 365 times means that God wants us 365 days a year. He wants us to have a fear not because He knows how bad things are. Well, that's not actually true. It's not 365 times. Depending on the translation that you're in, the translation that I'm using right now has it 202 times. Regardless of how many times it's in there, God doesn't want us to live with a spirit of fear. He wants us to know that we have the ability in His power to fight whatever wars, whatever battles, whatever struggles He wants us to fight. And so when we see this, Nehemiah tells these people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord. Remember all of these things that the Lord has done for us, because He uses two words. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. The Lord who is great. The Lord who has done everything that He has for you. And I'm sure these Israelites, I'm sure these Jews remember all of the things that their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their great-great-grandparents have told them throughout the years of how God had provided for them, how God had done so many different things for them. He says, remember this God, remember the Lord who is great and awesome. And then He says this, and fight. Fight for your brothers. Fight for your sons, fight for your daughters, fight for your wives, and fight for your homes. Remember what God has done for you and fight. I think we live in a world where we need to see people fight for their families. I see it all too often. Our times when I'm involved with schools and different things, and you see children, you see students who struggle with so many different things, and you see families who are broken and who are hurting for so many different things, and I wonder, is anyone fighting for those? Is anyone fighting for these children? Is anyone fighting for these students? Mom and dad who fight, or who not fight, mom and dad who are having marital issues, are they fighting for each other or with each other? It's a big difference. It's a huge difference to fight for someone as opposed to fighting with someone. As a church, are we fighting for the next generation? But more important than that, as a family, are we fighting for our families? There's three ways that I want to give us. There are more ways than this, but just three things I want to give you quickly that I believe are keys to fighting for our families instead of with our families. This first key is stay in their business, stay in their lives. Now remember, I mentioned at the beginning that each one of us in this room, we have different family dynamics right now. Some of you have younger children who are, just learning how to walk. Some of you have children in elementary school, middle school, high school. You have children who are working and have your own grandchildren. So all families have their different dynamics. Regardless of your family dynamic, stay in their business. Stay involved in their life. If you're a grandparent, stay involved in your children's lives. Stay involved in your grandchildren's lives. Dr. Kimmel, even yesterday, it was very funny. He said that being a grandparent, it's like being in the Holy of Holies. He said it's the best thing in the world. He's able to, have all of the benefits of having children, and he's just able just to love on them and then send them home to mom and dad whenever it's time to go home to mom and dad. Stay involved in your grandchildren's lives. Parents, regardless of the age of your children, stay involved. Stay in this fight with them. If you're like me and you have children who are still in your home, hey, stay in their business. I can't tell you the number of times I have parents who come and they sit across my desk. And I'll say this, and maybe even individuals in this room, you have this issue. I have parents sit across my desk, and Brandon, we found out that our son is struggling with an addiction to pornography. Pornography is the biggest issue, struggle facing any group from the age of 15 to 24 in the world today. And I have parents that come across and they say they're struggling with pornography. And the first question that I ask them, how are they looking at their pornography? They're looking at it on a computer, or a desktop at home, or a laptop. You know the number one way they're looking at it? It's their cell phones. And countless times, as I'm talking to these parents, I say, so you just found out they're struggling with this on their cell phone. How often do you check up on their cell phone? Oh, I don't look at their cell phone. That's their business. No, it's not their business. Stay in their business. Because if you don't stay in their business, they're going to get into some things they don't need to be into. But when you're in their business, it doesn't shock you. You understand that they're struggling with this. Now it's my job to help you in this discipleship process. Dr. Kimley said yesterday that they don't punish. We shouldn't punish our children. What? No, he says we should discipline them, and he's right. It's not just about punishing. You know, I tell parents, it's not, now that you've caught them in this act, now that you've caught them with this issue, it's not just about punishing them. It's about helping disciple them, helping them know, okay, this is a struggle that you've got. Let's help you work on this. It's a struggle. It's something you're going to face. All right, but the only way that you can do that is by staying in their business. Stay in their business. They might not even want you to stay in their business. But as mom, as dad of these children, it's your God-given responsibility and right to stay in their business. The second key to fighting for our families is to fight with love. Fight with love. Fight understanding that I love this child, regardless of how young or old they are. I love this child so much that even when they turn their back on me, I'm still going to love them. There might be some times when we discipline them that it hurts us, but we understand that this discipline comes from my love for this child. We have to fight with love. So many children that we see all the time. Any of you ladies or gentlemen in here who are teaching public schools, you see it every single day. You see children who are in your classrooms who don't know what love is, who when they fight or when their parents fight with them, they're not fighting with love. They're fighting with judgment. They're fighting with physical objects, and they're fighting with so many different things. As a Christian family, we need to fight with love because ultimately, Scripture teaches us that God is love. So if we're fighting with love, guess what? We're also fighting with God. And I'd much rather fight with God than I had anything else. The last of these keys, and again, like I said, this is not the only list. There are many other things, but these are just three that I wanted to touch on tonight. The last one is do not wait, fight now. Do not wait, but fight now. Don't wait until you're able to make this statement. I wish I had more time. I wish I had a little more time to be able to make an impact in his or her life. I wish I had a little bit more time to teach them what I think they need to know. Don't wait until you can make that statement. Don't wait if you have children who are in school right now. Don't wait until they're a junior or senior and say, okay, I need to start now. Because if you wait until they're a junior or senior in high school, you've lost a whole lot of time. You've wasted a whole lot of time. Don't wait until you can make this statement. I wish I had more time. Some of you who are grandparents, don't wait to help and to love and to raise and to cherish those grandbabies. Love on them now. Don't wait until you wish you had more time. I think one of the most important things that we can do is understand that God has given us the family. If you study the Scriptures, God created the family before he did anything else after creation. The last thing that he does in his creation is he creates Adam. After creating everything else, he creates Adam. After Adam spends some time, he says, you know what? Adam needs somebody else. There's something else that Adam needs, and he creates Eve to create this family. He created the family before he created the church. So I believe that our families are more important than the church. I honestly believe that. If not, he would have created the church first. When we think about this, that God took time to create the family, I think it's something that we should maybe realize, if it's important enough for God to create it, it's important enough for us to fight for it. Are we willing to fight for our families?